Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Wednesday everybody. Xi Jinping has reappeared in public, putting to rest the Twitter rumours over the weekend, of which we were already highly sceptical, that the General Secretary was under some sort of house arrest. Xi led the Politburo Standing Committee, as well as members of the wider Politburo, to a visit to the Forging Ahead in a New Era exhibition in Beijing. An exhibition, according to state media, quote, on the great achievements of the party and the country over the past decade, end quote. That is, during Xi's tenure in power. In a speech at the exhibition, Politburo Standing Committee member and Xi's ideology czar, Wang Huning, praised his boss and benefactor, expressing that China is rising in ascendancy and majesty, leading a historic shift in global power, and that the reason is because of, quote, the helmsmanship and leadership of General Secretary Xi Jinping and the sound guidance of Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics, end quote. Xi, for his part, expressed that over the last decade, under the leadership of the party, China has seen, quote, historic achievements and shifts take place, equipping the country with better institutions, firmer material foundations, and a more proactive mindset for realizing national rejuvenation, end quote. Okay, as always, let's move through the economic developments, and let's start by quickly going through this week's State Council Executive Meeting, then moving to a few more concerning stories. Premier Li Keqiang hosted this week's State Council Executive Meeting, and the major themes were tax relief and unemployment. According to the State Council Executive Meeting readout, China will allow market entities to defer payments of certain government-levied charges to further reduce financial burdens and offer tax concessions for private pension schemes. Li Keqiang stressed the need to enhance government services, ensure the autumn harvest is successful, and promote employment, expressing, quote, market entities, especially micro, small and medium-sized enterprises, now face considerable difficulties. Postponing the collection of government-levied charges and deposits is an important step to support market players. All policies must be delivered on the ground without delay, end quote. Personal income tax concessions will be made available for private pension schemes too, and the tax levied on investment yields will also be removed. Okay, next up, yet another reminder of why the State Council and others in the top leadership have been so worried for the economy these last several months. New World Bank forecasts predict that China's economic output will lag behind the rest of Asia for the first time since 1990. In its new report published this week, the Washington-based World Bank revised down its forecast for gross domestic product growth in the PRC to only 2.8%, down from its previous forecast of between 4 and 5% made back in April. In stark contrast to this deepening pessimistic outlook, expectations for the rest of East Asia have improved. The region, excluding China, is expected to grow at 5.3% in 2022, up from 2.6% in 2021. Zero COVID has been cited as a leading reason for the slowdown. Quote, China, which was leading the recovery from the pandemic and largely shrugged off the Delta difficulties, is now paying the economic cost of containing the disease in its most infectious manifestation, end quote. The ongoing property crisis was cited as a chief factor too, with the World Bank describing the housing sector as representing a, quote, deep structural problem, end quote, and recommended that, in the short term, Beijing provide more liquidity support to distressed developers and financial guarantees for project completion. And over the longer term, the structural issue of local government reliance on land use sales needs to be reformed. More on this tomorrow. But next up, the Belt and Road Initiative. Hey guys, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit the like button. And for anyone who is willing and able to help me keep this channel financially sustainable, if you like what I'm doing with China Update and you want to help me continue doing it, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. As always, thank you so much everybody for the ongoing support. Like I said, next up, there is renewed attention on China's lending practices to developing economies as part of Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative, as China reduces lending in the face of poor decisions of the past. US-based Wall Street Journal writes that after nearly a decade of pressing Chinese banks to be generous with loans, Chinese policymakers are discussing a more conservative program, dubbed Belt and Road 2.0, in internal discussions that would more rigorously evaluate new projects for financing. The publication, citing sources, writes that policymakers have also become open to accepting some losses on loans and even renegotiating debt, something that they had previously been unwilling to do. In 2010, only 5% of China's overseas loans were held by countries considered to be in financial distress. Now, this is over 60%, a deterioration which has spooked policymakers. Quote, "I've long argued that what others described as debt-trap diplomacy was in fact mostly inexperience. China has made the same set of mistakes that every other country has when it has first gone out. During the days of rising trade surpluses and surging commodity prices, it was too easily impressed with its own lending skills and far too optimistic about repayment prospects. That was never going to last, however, and soon enough we would see a sharp reduction in Chinese lending to developing countries. That started happening in 2015-2016, and I expect Chinese loans to developing countries only to decline further over the next few years." End quote. While this decline appears likely, a full retreat from the Belt and Road Initiative is unlikely. The ambitious project is a flagship policy of Xi Jinping himself, who is likely to achieve a third term in his position. Okay, and last up for today's video, US technology giant Meta, in a report, has published details on an operation to, quote, "remove coordinated inauthentic behavior from China and Russia," end quote. The company says that this operation ran across multiple social media, including Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and 2 Czech petition platforms, with the company expressing, quote, "This is the first Chinese network we disrupted that focused on US domestic politics ahead of the midterm elections, as well as Czech's foreign policy towards China and Ukraine. Chinese influence operations that we've disrupted before typically focused on criticizing the United States to international audiences, rather than primarily targeting domestic audiences in the United States," end quote. Ben Nimmo, Meta's lead official for global threat intelligence, said the operation reflected a, quote, "new direction for Chinese influence operations," end quote. The US-based New York Times, writing about the operation, observes that the posts appeared during working hours in China, typically when Americans were asleep, and that they dropped off noticeably during what appeared to be a, quote, "substantial lunch break," end quote. This will certainly ring a bell for any viewers who have worked in China. Nimmo expressed to the outlet that even if the campaign failed to go viral, quote, "the company's disclosure was intended to draw attention to the potential threat of Chinese interference in the domestic affairs of its rivals," end quote. This episode once again raises discussions and questions related to technology platforms, information dissemination, national security, regulation, and the role of freedom of speech in all of this. A difficult and ongoing debate in many countries, particularly developed economies. Quote, "The campaign sounds small and poorly executed, but is a bad sign. If there are similar efforts on TikTok or WeChat, will we get reports on activities from ByteDance or Tencent?" End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you everybody for watching. I'll see you tomorrow.